Hello, my name is Tom Degnan, and I am a columnist with Irish America magazine. And we are privileged today to be joined to have a chat with Emma Donoghue, the great Irish Canadian, as she describes herself, novelist. She has a new book out called The Pull of the Stars. And we're going to talk about that new book, all about her storied career. And most importantly, this very timely book that she's written. And I guess, Emma, if you don't mind, actually, why don't we just start? Tell me where you are talking to us from today.
I'm out on my porch in London, Ontario, where I've lived since 1998, in fact. I'm from Dublin, but I left Dublin at 20 and went to England to do a PhD at Cambridge. And then from there on to Canada. So I've emigrated twice, which is extremely Irish of me, I suppose.
I did want to ask you about that because, you know, authors, there's not much space for an author bio on the back of a book. And you make a point of saying you're an Irish immigrant twice over. Why is it kind of important for you to say that? Why do you want to put that up?
Well, I suppose even though I've been out of Ireland longer than I was in it, in that I left at 20, I think those first 20 years shaped me and I will be Irish for the rest of my life. You know, it has a very, very strong effect. The flavor is cooked deep into the bone, you know. But also I think having emigrated has really shaped me, and there are certain themes that come up over and over in my work, and not just literal emigration that comes up a lot, but also stories of people like in Room, when the boy steps out into the outside world for the first time. That's really an emigrant story. I'm very interested in people suddenly finding themselves in new worlds and having to adapt to them.
This book, Room, you've written, I've never heard of it. Oh, I'm joking. I'm kidding, obviously. We'll get to that certainly later on. The final question, though, before we get into the new book is, you mentioned, you just talked a little bit about where you're from. You settled in Ontario. Can you tell us a little bit about the circumstances of why you ended up there?
Sure. Well, I fell in love. You know, I was in England at Cambridge doing a PhD, and I probably would have gone back to Ireland afterwards, but I fell for Chris, and we've been together in Canada ever since. So, you know, these things are so random. You just have to trust your own stars.
That is a fitting segue. Obviously, you know, we have to point out that we're doing this on a technology no one had heard of a few months back. And yet, and you wouldn't think that your book is set 100 years ago, and yet obviously there's an intimate connection. Normally in an interview like this, I would probably spend a little time asking you about just how life has changed during a pandemic, but it's impossible to not also talk about your book at the same time. So for people who may not be aware, the book is set during the Spanish influenza plague of 1918. You obviously, unless you have a time machine, didn't know what was coming. So when did the moment arrive where you saw that this book you were working on was going to have a new layer of relevance that you obviously didn't know? What was, do you remember starting to say, hey, what happened?
You'll think I'm a bit stupid, Tom, but I was so immersed in finishing the book that I didn't really notice COVID starting. I started this book back in October 2018, prompted by the centenary of the 1918 pandemic. And I wrote it with no idea of any contemporary relevance, except that any good historical novel is always going to have some echoes of what's going on in the writer's own world today. But I never thought of it as relevant in a direct way. And then I finished the final draft very early March this year. And I kind of looked up and blinked and thought, oh yeah, this COVID thing, I suppose in some ways that could be considered an echo of my book. But I never thought of it as relevant to the publishing of the book, because the book was not meant to come out until next year. We were planning, because of the US presidential election, our publishers were like, oh, let's put the book off till 2021. So I thought, oh, well, but then suddenly in April, they said, you know what, people could really use a pandemic story right now. So let's hurry it up. I still can't believe they brought it out so fast and so beautifully. I mean, this exquisite cover with this nurse's watch from 1918. It's a ravishing piece of work.
Did any part of that bother you? We're going to get rushed a little bit, or are you okay with that?
It didn't bother me at all, because I knew they would do a beautiful job. I just felt a little bit sheepish about trying to sell anything during this time, you know. But if we waited until next year, I think people would be totally sick of pandemic stories by then. So it does make more sense to publish it now. And also, I'm really glad to be publishing a book which is all about healthcare workers right now. I think a lot of us are deeply grateful to them, and we realize that it's only them who's standing between us and mass death. And there are so many moving stories of healthcare workers either catching and dying of COVID or risking unquantifiable things for their own families. So I'm thrilled to have a novel which is all about nurses, doctors, hospital volunteers, orderlies, cleaners, just the entire spectrum of people who sort of work in a hospital much as soldiers used to fight in the trenches, you know, just keeping death at bay.
As you said, the book is set in a Dublin maternity hospital, I guess. It's
in the maternity ward of a Dublin hospital, yeah.
And it is catering, it is explicitly catering to those suffering from the Spanish flu. And it is set over the course of 3 days. And with that setup, I'd actually like you to tell me a little bit more. Generally speaking, why did you want to write about, you know, the Spanish flu before all this started? And then did the characters come alive sort of organically, or did you have a specific approach in? Tell me a little bit about just sort of how this all started.
Well, any pandemic makes good copy, right? Because not only is it individual medical dramas, but there's a kind of a web connecting people in that they're not sure what they'll catch from each other. So it makes everyday life a little bit dangerous, a little bit fraught. It brings up all sorts of ethical dilemmas about how we treat each other. You know, we're all having discussions right now about how to keep the vulnerable in our society safe, for instance. How much inconvenience will people put up with in order to do that? So I thought the 1918 pandemic was a particularly interesting one because it was such a modern world. You know, these people were switching on electric lights and going to work by tram and train. It wasn't, you know, ye old medieval times. And yet they had no idea what to do when this plague hit. They really knew nothing about it. They didn't even know what a virus was. So I thought it was a hugely high stakes situation to put a story in. And the fact that really hooked me was when I discovered that women in late pregnancy or during or just after birth were particularly vulnerable to catching this horrible strain of influenza, and particularly vulnerable to having birth complications or premature births and dying of it. So I thought, oh, there's my story right there. Now, I could have set it anywhere in the world, right? Because Ireland was not the worst at all. And many countries in Asia and Africa had a worse time of it. But I wanted to be on home territory to make it really authentic. And also Ireland was going through such interesting political upheavals around then, between about 1916 and 1919. So many people beginning to sort of move their sympathies to the side of nationalism. So I thought it would be great to take Irish society at a point where everything's changing. You know, World War I is on. It's just a non-stop kind of maelstrom of change and action.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff there I want to dig a little deeper into, but you also made an interesting sort of stylistic choice here. There's essentially 4 breaks in this entire novel, and that's it. Why did you want to do that?
Yeah, you know, if you're designing a book to be an easy read, you go for really short chapters. I remember, for instance, reading Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code when I was breastfeeding, and it was perfect, tiny little snippets. So 4 chapters is pretty grueling. I want the reader to have a grueling experience. I also make them work a little bit harder to understand what's going on. I don't use quotation marks. This is the first time I've ever used that style, but it just seemed to suit this particular story. I try not to have a kind of house style, Tom. I really try and adapt my literary voice to the requirements of the story. And this time around, I just wanted that slightly hallucinatory atmosphere of, you know, the words that Julia, my nurse protagonist, the words she says and what other people tell her, and the comments of her patients, one of whom is delirious. I wanted all these words to sort of flow through her head, not separate from her own thoughts. So with every book, I kind of make my stylistic decisions based on what it needs. And in particular, I wanted to name the chapters after something really concrete, you know, instead of medical danger being a kind of an abstract issue or a matter of statistics. So one detail I found early on was that this flu was often called the blue flu or the black flu, because a lot of people got cyanosis, where because of a lack of oxygen in their tissues, they would darken. So they would go from kind of red face to brown face to blue face to black faced. And I thought, oh, that's like a, you know, amber alert or a color code for danger. I'm going to use those colors as my chapter titles. So all I can say is that the particular situation and story of this book shaped a lot of my artistic choices.
Well, based on that description, as a person who has read the book, I do want to add that if it if it is grueling in the sense of what you're describing, it also is a page turner. I mean, the lack of breaks, or however you want to put it, it does not detract from the fact that this is a sort of a thrilling book. It has down moments, but really what they do is they set up these explosions of trauma and conflict that are inevitable in a situation like that.
Thank you. I'm really glad it worked for you. You know, the pace of it was partly dictated by the fact that the women in it, most of them are at some point in the process of giving birth. And I really wanted to use birth as a good storyline, in that it's really unpredictable. It's not an illness, right? So you can sail in there thinking, oh, my baby's going to pop out just fine. And then things can suddenly go horribly wrong, even after the birth, say. A lot of women gave birth happily and then died of infection. But equally, you could be having the most grueling time. You think you're going to die, and then next minute, pop babies out, and you feel so happy. So I loved that unpredictable storyline and the kind of stop and start rhythm of birth. And in a way, by making these long chapters, I'm kind of persuading my reader to join me in the kind of work of being with these women as they wait to be finally freed of their babies. And this being Ireland, you know, I'm showing a lot of patients, especially from the slums, who are just having baby after baby and are worn out by it. You know, it's a very particular kind of, you know, pro-natalist culture, Ireland in the 1910s.
Just before we continue, let me remind people we are talking to Emma Donoghue, best-selling author, about her new book, The Pull of the Stars. My name is Tom Degnan. We're doing this interview for Irish America magazine. Emma, you brought up some other things that were also going on in Ireland at the time. You very subtly, this is a Spanish flu book, but it is also about the Easter Rising. It is also about the birth of the Irish nation in some ways, and the way Ireland handled birth and child rearing, and you sort of managed to get all that stuff in there. And without tipping the plot too much, there are some, you know, there are some tough historical truths in here. Why did you want to explore that stuff also?
Well, the funny thing is I really didn't. Okay, I tried to keep the politics at bay. When I was growing up, you know, even though I've always loved stories of the past, but I didn't want to study history at university because I was just so sick of Irish history, which was just one tiny revolution after another. You know, it seemed like this endless pattern of fighting with the British and, you know, the national question, as they called it. I was just turned off that whole thing as a 1970s child living in the Republic of Ireland. I was just bored of it. So the last thing I wanted to do was to write a novel about the Irish sort of revolutionary process. I really wanted to write this novel about the Spanish flu, but the politics crept in, partly because I needed to explain how the society was so divided that even in the hospital, you know, you had quite a few of the doctors off serving voluntarily in World War I on the British side, you know, loyal to the king, and you would have other doctors jailed because they were on the Sinn Féin side. And in particular, when I was looking for any women doctors, I came across Kathleen Lynn, who was this remarkable character. She took part in the 1916 Rising. She was on the roof of the Dublin City Hall. She was chief medical officer of Sinn Féin, and she was actually on the run from police during the few days that I'm writing about in this novel. So, you know, I was fascinated by her, the combination of being a doctor and a revolutionary and a suffragist and a sort of labor rights activist. So I tried putting in a woman doctor like her, but then in the second draft, I thought I might as well give Kathleen Lynn full credit here. And in a way, she started to influence Julia Power, my nurse protagonist, who's just trying to concentrate on her job, you know, because she starts to point out the connections between you know, the poverty and the bad health and the death rate of these patients from the slums and this really mismanaged country, you know. So for Kathleen Lynn, it's obvious that if Ireland ran its own affairs, it would do a better job. And there's a moment where Julia says, oh, I've no time for politics. And Dr. Lynn says, everything's politics. So yeah, the politics really crept into this one.
How terrible is it that you have this Kathleen Lynn, who is beyond a fascinating figure? And I don't know about you, but I did not hear of her until I read your book. It's unbelievable how people
I didn't hear of her before I researched this. Yeah, no, you're not alone in this. And she would have been a much bigger deal, but she really got a lot of resistance in the Catholic Church. She wanted to found a hospital for children with infectious diseases, such as a lot of them had congenital syphilis. and no hospitals would take children with infectious diseases. So she wanted to found one, and she wanted the Catholic Church to help her. She was a Protestant, and the Catholic Church was like, no, no, if it's not going to be a Catholic run institution, we won't help. So she founded her own tiny hospital for children, which lasted many, many decades. So yeah, she was a very buried figure, but she's one of a number of Irish women who are really starting to be paid a lot more attention nowadays.
Before we talk about some other books and your career, I did want to ask you about your main character, Julia Power, correct?
Yes.
And you are absolutely right in the sense that this book conveys the heroism of nurses and healthcare professionals, and we're seeing that today as well. Can you talk, did this character change much over the drafts? Did she evolve as a character? I'll give the listeners a little spoiler. Towards the end, she has a big decision to make. And tell me a little bit about how she grew on you as a character. Did you have something in specific you wanted to say about her? Talk about her a little bit.
Sure. I think the main way she changed is that she started to open up a little bit to a political analysis of what's going on, because she cares so much about her patients, and she's so focused on them, and she's so aware that they come in already so weakened and banjacks by their lives. Even though I didn't do any rewriting of this book to match, to echo the COVID pandemic, I did notice all sorts of echoes in that, we're noticing a lot now that communities that are, hard hit by bad air, by bad water, lack of healthcare, poverty, diabetes, those are the ones suffering most in COVID. And very similarly with 1918, the government advice at the time was all about, if you feel a symptom, lie down for 2 weeks and have yourself nursed. Try telling that to the poor. And similarly, the governments would say, avoid damp, crowded conditions. How does a slum dweller do that? So I suppose I allowed Julia to evolve in that she started to put the pieces together a bit more. When I started the book, I didn't know much about Julia, but I knew I wanted it to be a nurse who was my protagonist, because first of all, nurses are interestingly kind of halfway up the chain of command in that they're so important, they save lives, but they have never had that much power. And in 1918, they had a lot less power than they have now. They had no authority to give any medicine. And above all, they weren't allowed to touch any of the doctor's toys, as it were. So a stethoscope, for instance, or the blood pressure device that they used, no nurse was allowed to touch those. So to have a figure who has a lot of agency in some ways, but very little authority, that makes a very interesting combination. And in some ways, this book is about a nurse, because nurses really came into their own during the flu pandemic. Doctors found they couldn't do that much. There was no amazing cure in terms of medicine. They tried aspirin, and a lot of doses were too high, and in some cases may have killed the patient. So they mostly resorted to using hot whiskey, which was just a comfort, really. So hands-on nursing seems to have been the crucial thing that helped you survive. There were no equivalent of ventilators, very little equipment being used. So yeah, and I suppose a lot of women, a lot of nurses in the records I was looking at, they looked back nostalgically at this time, and they were like, those thrilling days in the epidemic, where we felt so needed.
And I do like the very ironic name you gave her, given her sort of marginal status.
It's so nice when you notice these things, Tom. Yes, she's called Power, because really she doesn't have much.
I've been a teacher for 2 decades now, and my students always yell at me. They say, the authors don't give them names like that on purpose. It's just a coincidence. I say, sometimes it is and sometimes it's not.
We do everything on purpose. We may not always choose to give a meaningful name. Sometimes it's just, Smith or Constanza, but where we give a name that has a metaphorical meaning, we usually know it. I remember publishing a book of fairy tales about witches once, and there were 13 of the fairy tales. And a student wrote to me to say, I've counted and there are 13, did you know? So yes, we notice.
Just to remind the listeners one more time, my name is Tom Degnan. I am talking with Emma Donoghue about her new book, The Pull of the Stars. It is set during the Spanish influenza epidemic of 1918, takes place in Dublin. And you brought this up earlier. I did want to talk about some of your previous work, and some of your stuff is deeply Irish, and some of it is set all over the world. And you said this one felt like something you wanted to do at home. And you're again, some writers just claim a time and place and they stick with it. You're not one of those writers. Sometimes it's set in the past, sometimes it's contemporary. Is there any thought process in there at all, or do you just wait for the muse and see where it takes you?
It's certainly not some career building strategy, no. I like to travel. I like to go be in other centuries and be in other places, though I usually stick to places that at least I have some familiarity with. Um, I think one reason that I go back to Ireland every few books is if I want to be quite critical of my culture. You know, it seems more polite to be critical of your own home culture than of someone else's. For instance, in The Pull of the Stars, there's quite a devastating critique of residential institutions like orphanages, reformatories, mother and baby homes, Magdalen hospitals. And you know, I could have done all that in Canada, talking about how our native children have been locked up in appalling institutions. But you know, it seemed to make more sense to do that kind of thing about your home culture, to sort of, you know, accept responsibility for the culture that you grew out of yourself. I know when I was growing up in Dublin in the 1970s, there were still these appalling, you know, reformatories where teenagers were locked up. Oh, there was one very near me in Dublin. I never knew a thing about it. So that would be an example of one reason I like to write books set in Ireland. But also I enjoy the humor and the speech. You know, I feel most comfortable in Irish idiom, and I like the kind of dark humor of, say, there's a character in the book who's an orderly, you know, toting the dead bodies around and wheeling in the new patients. And I really enjoyed giving him a very kind of dark humor, and he's constantly bursting into song, for instance.
And for my money, he has the best last name in the book.
He's called Groin. Yeah, and that you can tell your students that's definitely intentional. You couldn't call someone Groin by mistake, even if you spell it with a Y.
Now, as great as Pull of the Stars is, probably your most successful book is the one you mentioned earlier, Room. It's a you know, a more contemporary book, and of course, not only was it a bestseller, it went on to become, it was optioned as a movie. Not only was it optioned, it was actually made into a movie, and not only was it made into a movie, it was an unqualified success that you ended up actually getting an Oscar nomination for, right?
Yes, and you know, it's all thanks to our wonderful Irish director, Lenny Abrahamson. I was so lucky, and I was smart in that I held out until I found him. I think that the writer's one real power is to say yes or no to a film contract. You know, you should not take the first Hollywood type who comes along and then afterwards complain that they made your book into a trashy film. You know, you have the power to say no. So I just said no to any overtures from Hollywood producers who didn't seem likely to get it right. And I did not want a trashy or tacky film to be made about this child growing up, you know, a product of captivity and rape. So I needed somebody who I trusted the taste of and the heart of. So Lenny Abrahamson, he's now an international name, and it was just wonderful with our film to see him getting, you know, an Oscar nomination himself and so much attention. So it was an Irish and Canadian film, and to see that film get all the way to the Oscars, it was just a delight. I was so happy.
Did being part of, I'm sure it's great on so many levels, but it's also just a big machine. Did being part of that sort of the machinery of storytelling a movie, did that leave a mark on you as you approach a new novel in any way particularly?
Well, I try never to write a novel, you know, as if it's a film, because that's kind of blurring the genres. And I think the genres each have their own real strengths. I mean, just to generalize, books are so great at psychology, you know, the nitty gritty of what's going through someone's head. There's enough time in The Pull of the Stars for me to give you really every thought going through Julia's mind for 3 nights and days. A film would have to simplify and truncate. But then films have a wonderful kind of ambiguity to them. I mean, so often in Room, we're looking at, you know, Brie Larson's face and Jake Tremblay's face, who played the child, and we don't quite know what they feel. And so we bring our own feelings, our own memories, and we sort of project it onto those film stars. And the effect is incredibly moving and deep. So, you know, it's not even that, oh, film's a big, shiny, expensive medium. It can be a deeply subtle medium. It's just a very different thing from a novel. So I've written both since. I'm involved in a number of film projects, and I always try and kind of play to the strength of the medium and say, how could the story be told through kind of light and faces, not primarily through words?
You kind of stole my next question, and it's doubly complicated because basically movie making is kind of shut down right now. But is there a project you're currently working on that you can talk about that we may soon see on a screen somewhere?
Absolutely. I think the next film will probably be one set in Ireland, which is a film of my novel, The Wonder, about a little girl claiming she can live without food in 1859 in rural Ireland. And that's going to be made by Element, the same company who made Room, but with a different director, and definitely filmed in Ireland. And I think that's the one that's farthest along in the process. So as you say, there are so many unknowns at the moment because of COVID. And then in film in general, there are so many things that can, block something's passage because it costs so much money. That's why writing novels for me feels the most satisfying, because nothing stands in my way. I don't need to worry about the budget for each word. All the words are free.
For people who are, once you're done reading Pull the Stars, I can't recommend The Wonder any more highly. It's an absolutely wonderful book. I loved it.
Thank you.
I guess as we wrap up, I want to ask two more questions, and one of them is, let's finally just stop relating your book to the pandemic. I am curious about how has this experience affected you? How are you finding it? Did you use this time to read anything or watch anything particularly interesting? Are you climbing the walls? How have you responded to all this?
I'm not climbing the walls at all. A writer's life is fairly locked down anyway. We stay home and read and write and talk to imaginary people in our heads. So it hasn't been a huge shift. And again, having the kids around doesn't particularly bother me. I've always, written on and off while they've been around. The pandemic for me started with a big blow, which is that we did a stage production of Room, and it was just having its North American premiere here in London, Ontario, and was about to go on to Toronto, where there were lots of New York producers coming to see it. So it could have been the start of a long life for this amazing show. And it was cancelled on opening night. 2 months of the run just completely cancelled. And that would be an example of how theatre is just devastated at the moment. And so many brilliant craftspeople and above all performers are out of work, and just they don't know when live performance is going to happen again. So I feel really bad for those who are in the arts, in performance. They can't just get on with their work the way, say, a writer can. So that was the only really tough thing in my pandemic, was cancellation of the Room show. Apart from that, it's been fine.
Is there one particular or two particular things you are looking forward to getting back to doing?
Theatre certainly does spring to mind, and travel. Usually Chris and I and the kids, we go back to Ireland every summer, and we had a cottage booked with friends on the west coast of Kerry, and seeing friends and family there. And my dad's in North Carolina, and I have good friends in England. So even if I don't travel as much from now on, and I certainly feel I don't need a book tour anymore, I'm finding these virtual events perfectly satisfactory, but I long to see friends and family, yes.
The final question I have for you today, Emma, is we mentioned something earlier about, people always trying to figure out what an author's secret message is or things like that. And as I was reading this book, very quickly, I had an echo of a book that does not seem a likely comparison. And the more I thought about it, there are a lot of comparisons to it. I thought of The Great Gatsby. Did this ever come to mind as you were writing it? The first
No, it didn't, but that's, no.
The first thing that happens immediately is there's this looming 30th birthday. And now, as a teacher, I've taught The Great Gatsby a lot, and Nick Carraway has this throwaway line that he's going to turn 30. But then the more I thought about it, here we have a sort of mysterious narrator, almost like an unreliable narrator, like Nick, who is confronted by this very mysterious, almost magical person who has this very profound effect on their life, which happens to Nick through Gatsby, which happens to Julia through this assistant who sort of wanders into her life. But it's interesting. I think I would be tempted to write, this may be Emma Donohue's attempt to rewrite Gatsby, but that was never on your mind, was it?
It doesn't have to be consciously on your mind. It could be absolutely true. I mean, of course, I read Gatsby, and every book I read is a little pebble in the river, so I'm not denying your theory at all. It's a very interesting one. I mean, to me, it's a little bit more obvious that this book was shaped by 15 years of watching Grey's Anatomy, but Gatsby could well be a more subterranean influence.
All right. Well, it's good to have the author to actually confirm a suspicion like that. Final question, I guess. What is the next? Do you have another novel in the works, or short stories, or anything you have that you can talk a little bit about in book form?
Actually, I think the very next thing to come out will be a long short story set in set 40 years from now. So my first attempt at the future. Yeah, that's going to come out in a collection at the start of September. So yeah, first time I've ever written a future world. It's really important, Tom, to keep trying new things, especially if you've had one hit. You know, you do not want to rest on your laurels or you will write badly. So just keep trying new things and keep yourself in a slight state of fear.
Well, good luck trying to write a scary future, because we know the present is, you're not going to top the present.
That's a good point.
We've been talking to Emma Donoghue for Irish American Magazine. We've been talking about her new book, The Pull of the Stars. My name is Tom Degnan. Emma, thank you so much for spending a little time with us during this pandemic, and can't wait to see what comes next.
I've really enjoyed your literary analysis, Tom. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Ending meeting now.